Hello class, welcome back. Hopefully you just finished watching the previous video in which I defined and described ethical relativism and tried to explain how this theory came to be the dominant theory of morality in the social sciences in the 20th century. This video will be an analysis, or really a criticism, of the theory of ethical relativism. And in short, ethical relativism is a theory that has immense practical and theoretical problems. In my experience, many students find ethical relativism to be a plausible moral theory. I think a large part of that has to do with the influence of 20th century social science on their thinking. But most people in my discipline recognize that this theory is flawed and maybe even fatally flawed. And by the end of this video, you should understand why that is, why there are a lot of very smart people, especially in philosophy and ethics, who think that this theory of morality cannot possibly be correct. So let's start with some definitions for analysis. And so I want to start by explaining to you the way the ethical relativist thinks of morality, or the way it's described in 20th century social science. And so this will be morality as defined by 20th century social science. So I'll give you some technical definitions for the purpose of analysis. I want to reference two. The first comes from 20th century sociologist William Graham Sumner. In a 1906 book, Folkways. And this is what William Graham Sumner says about morality. The tradition is its own warrant. The notion of right is in the folkways. In the folkways, whatever is right. When we come to the folkways, we have reached the end of our analysis. So William Graham Sumner says, the tradition is its own warrant. In the folkways, whatever is right. The second social scientist I want to reference is the anthropologist Ruth Benedict. And I have two quotes from her. The first is from a 1934 book, Patterns of Culture. Excuse me, 1934. And in Patterns of Culture, Ruth Benedict says, morality differs in every society and is a convenient term for socially approved habits. Morality differs in every society and is a convenient term for socially approved habits. The next quote is also from Ruth Benedict, a 1967 book called Anthropology and the Abnormal. And in Anthropology and the Abnormal, Ruth Benedict says, the concept of normal is properly a variant of the concept of good. It is that which society has approved. The concept of normal is properly a variant of the concept of good. It is that which society has approved. And so these quotes from Ruth Benedict and William Graham Sumner are to illustrate the ethical relativist theory. That is, this is what the ethical relativists and the 20th century social scientists were saying, is that morality varies from culture to culture. Really, each culture has its own customs and its own norms and its own traditions, and those customs and norms and traditions are the moral codes of those cultures. So morality really is nothing but norms and traditions which vary from culture to culture. And so that's why morality is relative. And so, again, William Graham Sumner says the tradition is its own warrant. That is, the fact that it's traditional is the justification. In the folkways, whatever is right. That is, whatever is the norm of behavior among the people is what constitutes right conduct for those people. Or Ruth Benedict. Morality differs in every society, right? Morals vary, as I pointed out in the last lecture. And really, morality is just a convenient term for socially approved habits. That is, morality is just what society approves of. Or again, Ruth Benedict, the concept of normal is properly a variant of the concept of good. It is that which society has approved. That is, if society has approved of behavior, if it's normal behavior, then that's what is meant by good behavior. And, okay, so this is the view of the cultural relativist. I think if you distill it down to its essence, according to cultural relativism, something is morally right if and only if it is traditional or customary or normal within a society. So this is the definition of ethical relativism that I would like to analyze. According to ethical relativism, to say that X is morally right is to say that it is normal or customary or traditional within a society. That is, according to cultural relativism, X is morally good if and only if it is in keeping with the norms and customs and traditions of a society. Different societies have different norms of behavior, different customs, different traditions, and therefore different societies have different moral codes. That's the ethical relativist view. And as I said at the outset, this is a theory that has very serious problems. And by the end of this lesson, you should understand what those are. So keep this definition in mind, and we'll analyze it. So X is morally right if and only if it is normal, customary, or traditional within a society. My dear friends here in the Jolt studio have provided me with new markers, which write better, but erase worse. So, anyway, thank you for your patience. Okay, where was I? Oh, okay, so according to the cultural relativist, X is morally good if and only if X is customary or traditional or normal within a society. Morality is really nothing but the norms of behavior within a culture. All right. Now, why is that wrong? I think that one's going to work very well. All right, so here are the problems. All right, so the cultural relativist says you should act according to the norms of your culture. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, well, what are the norms of my culture? What is a culture? What is my culture? So, especially as Americans, we live in a diverse, multicultural society, and most of us belong to more than one culture, or can identify with more than one culture, and sometimes the norms of those cultures differ. And in those cases, how do we know which one is the correct one for us to follow? If I'm just supposed to do what's normal in my society, I mean, so for example, I am French Catholic on my father's side and come from a long line of English Protestants on my mother's side. And so, well, am I French or English? Am I Protestant or Catholic? I grew up I was born in New England, in New Hampshire. But I grew up in the South, in Virginia. Am I a Northerner or Southerner? Northeast and Southeastern United States, are those a single American culture, or are they separate cultures? Is my culture our society's historically Christian, so are we a Christian culture? But we're increasingly secular. Are we a secular culture? I'm a member of the college and the university. Am I part of a university culture? What do I do when the Christian culture is contradicted by the secular culture? How do I know which one is predominant? Or this kind of question is especially acute for first and second, especially like second generation immigrants who actually find themselves sort of torn between two cultures. That is, they do identify with the culture of their parents and grandparents and ancestors, the culture from the old world, but they also, having grown up in the United States and gone to American schools and watched American movies and listened to American music, find themselves increasingly identified with the culture of the New World. And so like if you're, for example, a Latin American immigrant, is your culture a Spanish-speaking Catholic culture, or is it an English-speaking Protestant culture? Sometimes those differ. Or, so that's one problem. So what culture even do you belong to? Because there's a variety of cultures and subcultures, and we're multicultural, and so there's that problem. But then there's an additional problem, which even if you could figure out what your culture is, how do you figure out what the norms of your culture are? Because the relativist says to act according to the norms of your culture, but isn't it the case that often people within a given culture disagree? So, like, if you take a debate like about, say, immigration or abortion or something like that in America, there's widespread disagreement. America is, as you probably know, politically polarized, and half the people are part of the red tribe, or conservative America, or rural America, or something like that, and half the people are part of the blue tribe, urban America or liberal America or something like that, and they disagree about almost everything: gun control, immigration, abortion, healthcare, education, etc., etc. And so, like, okay, which one of those belief systems or worldviews constitutes the worldview of our culture, or do they both? And if they both do, well, they contradict, and so they're not giving us very good moral guidance. And so, okay, this is the first problem for ethical relativism. Put it in the form of a question: what counts as a culture? If the advice is to act according to the norms of my culture, how do I figure out what those are? Okay, that's problem number one. Second problem for ethical relativism, and a lot of philosophers think that this is especially weighty, is the cultural relativist seems to be motivated by an attitude of tolerance, open-mindedness, non-judgment, non-interference. That is, they believe that their theory is an antidote to dogmatic thinking and bigotry, that they teach us to respect each other's differences, to celebrate our diversity, to approach other cultures, people with different worldviews, with an open mind, to not be so judgmental. So in short, I think one of the strengths of the ethical relativist position is that we should be tolerant and open-minded. But if you think about it, technically, does their theory recommend that we should be tolerant? Well, how should I act according to ethical relativism? Well, the ethical relativist says the right thing to do is to act according to the norms of your culture. Well, in that case, is tolerance the right thing? Seems like it would depend on whether or not I lived in a tolerant culture. That is, it seems like the cultural relativist telling me to act according to the norms of my culture would tell me that if my culture is tolerant and open-minded and non-judgmental, then I too should be tolerant and open-minded and non-judgmental, because that's the custom of my people. But suppose I live in an intolerant, judgmental culture. Suppose I came from a misogynistic culture, or a culture that was intolerant of homosexuality, or intolerant of religious differences, or heterodox thinking, or should I too be intolerant? There's something Karl Popper refers to as the paradox of tolerance, which is, does our tolerance of other cultures require us to tolerate intolerant cultures? And so there's this paradox about tolerance. The way I would phrase this is that the ethical relativist wants to treat tolerance as an objective value while simultaneously denying objective values. All right, so ethical relativism treats tolerance as an objective value while simultaneously denying objective values. That's the second problem. Here's a third problem. Cultural relativism is based on the idea that morals vary from culture to culture, that different cultures do in fact have different moral codes. Different cultures do in fact have different traditions and different customs and different norms of behavior. Some are polygamous, some are monogamous. Some eat pork, some don't. Some eat beef, some don't. Some require women to dress modestly, some don't. There's different attitudes about gender roles. There's different attitudes about sexuality. There's all these cultural differences. Morals do in fact vary from culture to culture. But the question here is, does the fact that morals vary from culture to culture prove that there isn't an objective morality? If you've been paying attention to this course, you should know that it doesn't. That the fact that cultures have different worldviews doesn't prove that everybody's worldview is correct or incorrect. That is, it's possible that our worldviews differ because there isn't an objective standard, but it's also possible that when our worldviews differ, it's because some of us are correct and others are incorrect. You could see this, for example, some cultures, ancient cultures, believed, even medieval cultures, believed that the earth was the center of the universe and that the sun orbited the earth, whereas we now believe that the earth orbits the sun, and neither the earth nor the sun are the center of the universe. And so some people believe that the earth orbits the sun, or some cultures believe the earth orbits the sun, and some cultures believe that the sun orbits the earth. It doesn't follow from that there's no objective truth in astronomy. It could just be that, as it is, that some of the cultures are correct in their astronomy and other cultures are incorrect. Why shouldn't the same kind of thing follow for moral claims? That is, some cultures believe in human rights, universal human rights, and other cultures don't. It doesn't follow from that there are no universal human rights. I mean, it could be that, or it doesn't follow from that human rights exist in some places and not others. I mean, it could be that the cultures who believe in human rights are correct and the cultures that don't are incorrect. It's entirely possible. So the mere fact that moral variance does not prove that morality is not objective. That is, cultural relativism rests on an invalid argument. That kind of conclusion doesn't follow from that kind of premise. So what I want to say here is the inference from moral variance to ethical relativism is logically invalid. That is, it is a matter of fact that cultures differ in their norms and customs and moral beliefs. It doesn't follow from that everybody's moral beliefs are true. It could be that when the cultures disagree, some of them are right and others are wrong. Okay, the inference from moral variance to ethical relativism is logically invalid. Now, I should say, in fairness, that the philosopher J.L. Mackie responds to this criticism by saying that the inference isn't meant to be a logical inference. It's meant to be, it's not meant to be a deductive inference. That is, the relativist isn't saying that moral variance proves that morality is not objective. They're just saying that moral variance is evidence that morality is not objective. That is, the inference is not a deductive inference, it's an inductive inference, or what J.L. Mackie says. It's an inference to the best explanation. That is, the best explanation of our cultural, moral differences is that morality is not objective. Okay, maybe you're impressed by J.L. Mackie's argument there. You can read about it. It's in the Ethical Life textbook, J.L. Mackie's On the Subjectivity of Values. Okay, so let's see. Cultural relativism says to act according to the norms of your culture, but what counts as your culture? What are the norms of your culture? Cultural relativism seems to advocate for tolerance, but there's an inconsistency there because they're treating tolerance as an objective value but denying objective values. That is, it seems according to their theory, only people who live in tolerant cultures should be tolerant. And it seems their theory would require us, in fact, to tolerate intolerance. So that's implausible. The inference from moral variance to ethical relativism is logically invalid. It's possible that some cultures have better moral beliefs than others. Okay, next thing. If you are impressed by J.L. Mackie's argument that the best explanation for our different worldviews is that morality is not objective, that is, if you do think that we should take moral variance as evidence against objective morality, wouldn't we also have to take moral similarities as evidence in favor of objective morality? So the point here is that cultures share many values in common. indeed, we are all more human than otherwise. And our differences are only apparent to us against a backdrop of underlying similarities. Regardless of what culture you find yourself in, you care about the welfare of your children. In the 80s, during the Cold War, there was a song by Sting called Russians, and the refrain was, "I hope that the Russians love their children too." On opposite sides of the Iron Curtain, you have on one side sort of democracy and on the other side communism or something like that. And on either side of the Berlin Wall, the people loved their children. The Russians were kind of offended by the song, of course, because it's like, of course we love our children. What kind of silliness is this? But that's actually the point. Regardless of your ideology, this is a quote from the song, "We share the same biology regardless of ideology. We're all more human than otherwise." In Eastern and Western Europe, they love their children the same. That's the point. And unsurprisingly, there are certain values that you find across cultures. There's something called the perennial philosophy, or the reoccurring philosophy. The religious scholar Houston Smith talks about this perennial philosophy in a book used to be called The Religions of Man, but now it's called The World's Religions, in which he argues that the world's religions are like wisdom traditions, and they contain what he calls the winnowed wisdom of the human race, and that there are certain sort of perennial or reoccurring truths within these traditions. And so, for example, almost every religion in the world teaches something like humility or selflessness, that is, you should not be so egotistical, you should not be so self-centered, you should be more altruistic, you should be more charitable, you should be more humble, you should be less proud. Or consider the idea of karma. Is that any different than the Christian idea that as you sow, so shall you reap, that you will reap what you sow, or karma? That's a reoccurring idea. Or, here's a good one, the Golden Rule, which says that we should do unto others as we would have them do unto ourselves. Probably, actually, if you truly understand the Golden Rule, you don't even need a class in ethics. That will do the trick. But that idea, the Golden Rule, that we should do unto others as we would have them do unto us, is a reoccurring idea. You can find something like the Golden Rule in almost every religious, philosophical, spiritual, cultural tradition that's ever existed. Or more simply, philosopher James Rachels, who I used to use his textbook in a lot of these lectures, still borrow heavily from him, so I'm indebted to him. He points out that every culture has to have at least 2 or 3 values in common. That is, every culture has to at least have a prohibition against the killing of the innocent, a requirement that people tell the truth, and a requirement that the people prioritize the welfare of their children. And if you think about it, you could see why this must be the case. I mean, any culture that didn't at least have those 3 values wouldn't function and wouldn't last. So I often ask students to imagine that you live in like a Hobbesian state of nature, where there are no laws, there are no morals, it's just every man for himself, what Hobbes called a war of all against all, where the life of man is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. What would you do if you lived in a war of all against all? Well, if you were smart, you'd try to find some people to cooperate. You'd sort of form together into some kind of a collective or a tribe. That is, people who could cooperate would stand a better chance of the war of all against all than people who tried to go it alone. But if you were going to team up with others and cooperate for your survival, well, you'd have to cooperate, which means you'd have to have rules. The first rule would be, well, we're not going to kill each other. And the second rule is we're going to tell each other the truth because we need to trust each other. You see, and so you notice once you've done that, you've formed a society with a rule against killing and a rule against lying. And if you don't at least have those rules, you don't have a society. And then, of course, how long is your society going to last? Well, only as long as you live, unless you also prioritize the welfare of the young and transmitting your cultural beliefs to the next generation. And so any society that doesn't prioritize the welfare of children will not persist. And so every society everywhere in the world has to at least have a prohibition against killing, lying, and prioritizing the welfare of children. I once read a case of a religious sect that had decided that they lived in the end times and that it would be irresponsible to bring children into the world, and so they all agreed not to have any offspring. Of course, this is the exception that proves the rule, because unsurprisingly, that sect died out after that generation. So, in the last lecture, I mentioned the anthropological study of infanticide. I don't know what James Rachels would say about that. But inasmuch as cultures do share values in common, which it seems that they do, the golden rule is a near universal. The idea of selflessness and humility is a near universal. The idea that honesty is a virtue is a near universal. And so, shouldn't we take that as evidence in favor of objective morality? What I would say, I guess, is if I'm going to follow J.L. Mackie and treat moral variance as evidence against objective morality, then in fairness, I should also take shared values as evidence in favor of objective morality. All right, so that's the fourth problem. Now, the last, I've saved what I think is really the best or most important for last, which is that accepting relativism has troublesome consequences. That is, if ethical relativism is true, then implausible implications follow. And so this is a technique to put in your critical thinker's toolbox called a reductio ad absurdum. So relativism can be easily reduced to absurdity. What that means is a reductio ad absurdum involves assuming something is true for the sake of argument and showing that that assumption has implausible, undesirable, or contradictory implications, and thereby falsifying the original assumption. So by reductio, cultural relativism cannot be true. Because if it was true, then you could not blame other cultures. So, if cultural relativism is true, then you cannot blame other cultures. And if you are a cultural relativist, you probably are thinking, well, yeah, no kidding, Mr. G, that's the whole point. Who are you to judge other cultures by the standards of your own? It's not your place to blame them. It's not your place to judge them. You shouldn't interfere with them. And to some extent, that seems reasonable. Like, for example, I think it's kind of strange that in certain Muslim cultures, women are required to cover their hair or their faces. I think it's kind of strange that in certain Aboriginal cultures, women go around bare-breasted. But who am I to judge them for how they dress? That's their culture. I think it's kind of strange that Jews don't eat pork when it's so delicious, and that Hindus don't eat beef when it's so delicious. But who am I to judge them for their dietary differences? And so to some extent, it does seem right to say that it's wrong to judge people just because their culture is different from yours, their lifestyle is different from yours. But surely there must be some limit to this. There's certain cultural norms, customs, and traditions that just seem wrong. The textbook author gives the example of honor killing, where people are killed by their own kin because they've dishonored their family in some way. And so typically this will take the form of a young lady who is killed by her father because she has made herself sexually impure and thereby brought dishonor on her family. And so the textbook author tells the story of a young woman in a Muslim country who was kidnapped, raped, and left for dead. And that when her father found her, he killed her because she was no longer a virgin. And it's better, according to their culture, it was better that she should be dead than that she and her family should have to live with the dishonor of her no longer being a virgin. So that's an honor killing. Do you want to say, well, who are you to judge? Or do you want to say, no, that's wrong. I don't care what your culture is, that's just wrong. Okay, so, for example, if cultural relativism is true, then you cannot blame other cultures for things like honor killing. But of course you can blame other cultures for things like honor killing. It's just wrong. And therefore, cultural relativism cannot be true. I'll give you another example. In the literature, there's a discussion of something called FGM, or female genital mutilation, or what you may have heard referred to as female circumcision. This is practiced in certain parts of Africa and the Middle East predominantly, and it involves the surgical alteration of the female genitals, usually sort of the external parts of the female genitals. Sometimes it involves the removal of the labia or the clitoral hood. In some cases, it even involves the removal of the entire clitoris. Some cases, it involves sewing the vaginal opening closed so that it's smaller. And this is millions of women and girls have had their genitals mutilated in this way as part of a cultural tradition. I once read an account of a woman who came from one of these cultures who spoke of the 3 pains of womanhood. So the first pain of womanhood was the FGM procedure, or the circumcision, where her genitals were surgically removed, which is very, very painful, as you ladies can surely imagine. And then the second pain of womanhood is the wedding night, when the marriage is consummated, because she's had her vagina sewed almost shut, and then her husband is of course going to forcefully tear it open on the wedding night. So that's the second pain of womanhood. And then the third pain of womanhood is of course childbirth. And that's just part of their culture. It's like, why do they do this? Well, the reasons they give are similar to the reasons that we Americans give for circumcising our boys. I mean, it's what everybody else does. You want your boys to fit in. You don't want them to be the only intact one in the locker room and be made fun of. So largely it's done to fit in. It's done for what they believe are hygienic reasons. That is, we believe circumcising boys and removing their foreskins is hygienic, and they believe that altering female genitals is hygienic. It's also done for aesthetic reasons. That is, people think that intact penises look funny and circumcised penises look better, and so it's a matter of sort of aesthetic preference. And of course, it's just a tradition. Okay, so we circumcise our boys because we think it's hygienic, we think it looks better, we want our boys to fit in, and it's what our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents did, and so it's the tradition. They surgically altered the women's genitals for similar reasons. Unlike male circumcision, though, I think FGM is more harmful, more painful, does more lasting damage. Oftentimes it can lead to, well, of course it's, I need not explain, removing the clitoris would be exceedingly painful. It often leads to all kinds of complications, infections. These girls are unable to walk. In some cases it leads to infertility. In some rare cases it even leads to death. And even if it works correctly, it involves denying women and girls sexual pleasure. That is, it makes sex painful for them. And so it's very harmful. And human rights groups and women's rights groups are campaigning vigorously to try to change these customs and traditions in the places where they're practiced. But of course, if cultural relativism is true, then they're doing something wrong by interfering in those cultures. And that's the question. Are they doing something wrong? Because you might reasonably want to say something like this. I don't care what their customs are. I don't care what their tradition is. Surgically removing a girl's clitoris is morally wrong. But if you're a cultural relativist, you can't say that. Because if cultural relativism is true, then you cannot blame other cultures, even for things like FGM. But of course, you can blame other cultures for things like FGM, and therefore, by reductio, cultural relativism cannot be true. Not only does cultural relativism imply that you can't blame other cultures, it also implies that you can't praise other cultures. Because both blame and praise of other cultures requires some objective standard independent of culture by which we could judge. That is, if you think about it, cultural relativism makes cross-cultural ethics impossible because cross-cultural ethics would involve some standard of right and wrong independent of the cultures. And they say that no such standard exists. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. I've always been impressed by the Japanese work ethic. That's why I buy Japanese cars. It's because I know they take pride in their work. And if you're into Japanese cars, Toyotas and Hondas and such, you know that the best ones are the ones that were made in Japan. They have a pride in their work. Okay, or like I love Nintendo games, you know, and I know a lot of my students, they love anime. And so we like Japanese culture, and they like our culture, interestingly enough. They like baseball and stuff. And so Japanese and Americans have a lot of cultural sharing, and we appreciate each other's contributions. Well, okay, but so I think that the Japanese work ethic is very good, for example. But in effect, that we could learn something from that. We used to have something in this country called the Protestant work ethic. And we used to really take pride in our work, but I think we've kind of gotten fat and lazy. And maybe we could learn a thing or two from the Japanese. But if cultural relativism is true, I can't say that. That is, if cultural relativism is true, you can't praise other cultures, because that would involve some standard of right and wrong independent of cultures. But of course, you can praise other cultures. I can praise the Japanese work ethic, and therefore cultural relativism cannot be true. Or here's another example of this. In China, they have something called filial piety. So that's a loyalty to your family, a sense of obligation to and respect for your ancestors and respect for your elders. And so the Chinese, they would never do what we do, which is when our old people get kind of tiresome, put them in a home, a nursing home somewhere so you don't have to deal with them. They would never do that. And so maybe we could learn something from the Chinese respect for their elders, their filial piety. Or another favorite example is although I hesitate to endorse the myth of the noble savage, I think there is a sense in which Aboriginal people had a superior kind of a relationship to the planet and superior ecological sensibilities. I once read a book by a guy named, I think his name was Daniel Quinn, called Ishmael, kind of a young adult novel that was recommended by a student about an ape who became an anthropologist, and he a talking ape who was an anthropologist. And he pointed out that one of the main differences between Aboriginal cultures and sort of modern Western culture is modern Western culture believes that the earth belongs to people, that people sort of have dominion over the earth, and it's something that they can use. Whereas Aboriginal people, indigenous people, often have a kind of a contrary idea that people belong to the earth. And so earth isn't something that people have dominion over. Earth is like their mother, and they are her children, and they have to treat her with respect and reverence. And you might think that's a pretty good idea, that instead of thinking that the earth belongs to us, that we belong to the earth. And so if you contrast, for example, the way the European fur traders slaughtered herds of buffalo, took their skins to sell and left their carcasses in the field to rot and drove them nearly to extinction. If you contrast that with the sort of sustainable hunting practices of the Native Americans who depended on those herds for their survival, the Native American way was better than the European way. That is, the Europeans could have learned something from the Native Americans. But if I'm a cultural relativist, I can't say anything like that, because if cultural relativism is true, then you cannot praise other cultures, even for their superior ecological, environmental sensibilities, for their sustainable ecology, their sustainable hunting practices. But of course, you can't praise the Native Americans for their sustainable hunting practices, and therefore, cultural relativism cannot be true. All right, so if cultural relativism is true, cross-cultural ethics is impossible. You can't blame or praise other cultures, but of course it is possible. You can blame or praise other cultures, and therefore, by reductio, cultural relativism cannot be true. One other kind of thing, if cultural relativism is true, then you cannot blame or praise your own culture either, which means moral progress is impossible. So if you think about moral progress, the idea is that there's some objective standard of right and wrong towards which we are progressing. And so, for example, in our culture, we've made significant moral progress over our 200 or 300 year history. That is, when this country was founded, slavery was still the norm in half the country. But we abolished slavery in the 19th century, and that was progress. That is, our country was better after we abolished slavery than it was before we abolished slavery. When this country was established, women weren't able to vote or hold public office, but we gave women the vote at the beginning of the 20th century, and that was progress. That is, our country was better after we gave women the vote than it was before we gave women the vote. And then later in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, passed the Civil Rights Act and outlawed segregation. So before our society was segregated, and little black children were first to go to inferior schools, and there were separate seats in the bus and separate water fountains, and so on and so forth. And we rightly recognized that was an injustice, that was manifestly unfair and unequal. And we passed the Civil Rights Act and abolished segregation, and that was an improvement. And so over our history, we've abolished slavery, we've given women the vote, we've passed the Civil Rights Act, we've abolished segregation, and we've moved, our society has become less racist and less sexist over time, and that has represented improvement. That has represented moral progress. But notice that moral progress implies that there's some objective standard that we are progressing towards, that we're closer to objectively being an objectively good society than we were before. Right? The cultural relativists can't speak of moral progress this way. That is, all they can say is that was the norm of our culture then, and this is the norm of our culture now. But there's no standard independent of then and now by which we can say now is any better than then. You see, it's actually the same point about blaming or praising other cultures, only here, instead of looking across the world, we're looking across time. And so, if cultural relativism is true, then moral progress is impossible, but moral progress isn't impossible, and therefore, cultural relativism cannot be true. The way the textbook author explains this is that cultural relativism implies that any kind of criticism of your culture is morally wrong. That iconoclasts or destroyers of icons or destroyers of traditions or critics of traditions are always guilty of moral wrongdoing because the tradition is good. But clearly, not all traditions are good, and sometimes the traditions deserve to be criticized and should be criticized, and therefore, cultural relativism cannot be true. This last criticism, that cultural relativism makes blaming other cultures for FGM and honor killing impossible, makes praising other cultures, even when we can learn from them, impossible, makes cross-cultural ethics impossible, and makes nonsense of the idea of moral progress. That's, in my view, the biggest problem for cultural relativism, and ultimately why most people in my discipline think that this theory is implausible. It's a very serious theoretical problem, well, and a practical problem. And so, well, so much for cultural relativism. It rests on an invalid argument. It ignores the way in which cultures are similar. It treats tolerance as an objective value while denying objective values. Makes nonsense of moral progress. Makes cross-cultural ethics impossible. Implies you can't blame other cultures even for truly heinous things. And implies you can't learn from other cultures. Despite the protestations of my students, a theory that seems to me very unlikely to be true. You don't have to agree with that, and I'd love to hear if you do or don't agree. I'd love to hear why in the discussions. But you should at least understand why a lot of very smart people have grave doubts about the plausibility of ethical relativism. Okay, so that's it. If you watch both these lectures, you should be good to go. You should be able to accurately define and describe ethical relativism. You should understand why a lot of smart people, especially in 20th century social science, thought that this view of morality was correct. And you should understand why a lot of smart people, especially in ethics and philosophy, here in the 21st century and late into the 20th century, thought that this theory couldn't possibly be correct. That is, you should see why there are smart people who think this is true and other smart people who think that it's not. Thank you very much. See you in the discussions. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or concerns. I'm always happy to discuss these things, especially this topic. It's one of my